What's up, everybody? In this edition of StarCraft 2 Team Strategy, I'm going to be going over the 3 versus 3 map pool. There's not going to be any gameplay, unfortunately, so if you guys are looking for that, you'll have to check out some of my other videos. But in this game, or in this map, for instance, we're going to be looking at, what are the strong points of this map, what are the weak points of it for each race, and we'll be going through that pretty quickly here. So this is Araken Citadel. This map is favored for Terran and Protoss, but especially Protoss. Warp-ins on the high ground, especially along these ledges, is very strong. It's also very easy to hide cannons and proxies on places like this, or even up here, or on this spot over here. Those are the things you need to kind of watch out for on this map. I always down this map as Zerg, just because the expansions are pretty much impossible to defend. Because the closest expand to your actual base that doesn't have rocks with it is all the way out here. And this one is so far away that if another team is pushing and they come to this ramp here, they can easily keep you from getting to your expand to defend it. Also, this expansion up here can easily be sieged by siege tanks or Colossus or blink stalkers or a whole bunch of other things. So really this map is pretty awful for Zerg. If you get late into the game, there's enough expands you can macro a little bit, but the expansions are just much more suited for Terran and Protoss teams. In general, tech strategies are very strong on this map because with these Xel'Naga towers, you can always see exactly where opponents are trying to come into your base. So it makes timing attacks not quite that good because you can easily defend these ramps. Even early Ling aggression can easily be blocked off and prevented completely, which will put the Zerg very far behind. Pushes that don't have siege tanks or Colossus or something with a lot of range aren't going to really be able to break in either on this map, because you can easily set up bunkers or cannons or anything along here and defend these routes into your base. I would say Colossus, tanks, and blink stalkers are all very strong strategies on this map. DTs are also very good, especially if you transition to blink stalkers later, because as I mentioned before, there's places where you can warp into the enemy base. So even if they have detection right at these ramps leading into their main, you can easily just warp in DTs with an overlord or a barracks or any number of other ways to get observation on the high ground. And then the other team doesn't have a whole lot they can do about it at that point. Also, the expands here make it very easy for tanks to defend this, because if you have one or two tanks here with a Xel'Naga tower, it's almost impossible to push in. So games tend to last pretty long on this map, especially when you have Terran and Protoss exclusively. Okay, well, the next game I'll get into is Cinder Fortress, which is another kind of team defense map like this, but it's a little bit different. Alright, the next map here is Cinder Fortress, and this map in general is a little bit better for defense than it is for offense, because the ramps are pretty easy to block in most cases. The rush distance is fairly long, and even if you do have a Zerg, there will be a hole in your base usually, but it's so small that you can easily block it off with a couple units. Or else, one player could obviously sacrifice a couple extra minerals early game to make an extra building. As far as Zerg goes on this map, they can also expand, which is a great part. If you're playing Zerg, you can be either offensive or defensive, and that's kind of what you want in the map pool. You don't want maps where you're basically stuck always having to do early Ling aggression, because if the other team knows it's coming, especially maps where there's some kind of team fortress similar to this one in Araken Citadel, then you get stuck trying to do some early pool strategy, which may or may not work out. So if you don't want to have to risk it, this is a pretty good map for Zerg. The expansions are very easy to defend. There's a lot of wide open space except for these kind of narrow choked off areas here. So that's great for Zerg armies, since they like to try and kind of get a surround or a concave on the enemy forces. Warp-ins and drops are pretty annoying on this map, because there's not too much space on this side, but the other side here has a lot of space along it, which makes it very difficult to defend drops, especially if you're kind of trying to defend your expansions and you have to run all the way back to your main base to defend drops. As far as Terran and Protoss go, I would recommend generally that you go for either Colossus or tanks, because these mineral lines here on every single expansion are able to be harassed by tanks or Colossus. Not so much this one off to the side, but either way you could siege up from right here and keep leapfrogging in, Or else, if you're using Colossus, there's a couple areas where you can make a couple force fields, and it's pretty easy to block off enemy forces from trying to surround you. So Colossus and tanks really strong in this map, and this map is made more for defense than it is for offense, although you can definitely have a lot of aggressive strategies work out on this map. So the next one we'll get into is Dig Site, which is made for offense, and I'll show you guys in just a sec. This is Dig Site, the next map in the map pool. This map favors Zerg teams, and especially Zerg Terran teams, because of the large ramps, the split bases, and obviously there's a pretty short rush distance between the outside bases. This isn't a whole lot of distance to go to get up to this point over here. So it's very difficult to defend on this map, but it's great for teams who want to be really aggressive. So teams with 2 Zergs, or even a Zerg, and a Terran, and a Protoss are pretty good on this map. Protoss, though, if you're playing without 2 Zerg partners, I would most likely just down this map, because even the expands later in the game are pretty hard to defend. There's only one expansion that I really think is safe at all, and that's the one back here. So unless if you're able to take this expand as the Protoss player, it's a very difficult map to play on. Because the large ramp usually means that if the other team has more Zergs and they're doing some kind of early Ling pressure, you end up having to delay your gas just so you can get a forge and defend properly. And when you have a delayed warp gate, if you're dealing with any kind of bio push or a 4-gate or something like that from the other team, then you're going to be completely screwed and you're not going to have any way to defend in time, because you just won't have enough units out. Either that or one of your partners will die because you did a gate forge opening, which is equally as bad. There's 2 parts that make this map pretty good for Terran. The fact that this ramp here can be you can kind of block these together if you're a Terran player. So that's one thing that makes it not too bad for Terran. And also if you have a Terran and Protoss team and they basically try and block this together, it makes it a little bit less worse for Protoss. Terran also has a nice little advantage of having these gold island expands, which really are only good for Terran. Because in general, Zerg's going to be going for an early pull strategy, and there's no reason they shouldn't just take these expands first anyways. So unless they're going for a Nidus Worm, there's not really much chance that Zergs are going to take the outside expands. However, Zergs who do get tier 2 eventually can prevent Terrans or any other race from taking these expands by sending an Overlord out here and spreading creep. Besides that, there's gold expands up in the middle, and kind of controlling these Xel'Naga towers is going to be a big help. But as the game drags on, you're going to find that timing pushes with tanks become really strong, and Protoss, if they have Colossus, can also be pretty strong on this map because there's not a lot of wide open spaces to surround Colossus. Okay, and the next map we'll get into is Frontier, which is an even more aggressively designed map for teams that really want to put on a lot of pressure. This is Frontier, the next map in the map pool for 3v3. This map is by far the hardest one to defend on. Even though the rush distance is fairly long on this map, you're going to notice that each base has 2 ramps, and one of the ramps is pretty narrow, but the other ramp is fairly large. But just the fact that it has 2 ramps means that you're always going to have to build close if you're not a Zerg player on this map. And even if you do block off one side of your base, you're still always going to have a spot where you're vulnerable to harassment, either by Lings, Banelings, or Hellions on this map. In general, if you don't have at least 2 Zergs on your team, you should be downing this map. There's no reason to play this map over some of the other ones in the map pool if you don't have 2 Zergs on your team. Because you're going to find that teams that just keep running around back and forth between bases and doing Ling run-bys are going to get so far ahead that they'll even be able to squeeze in a couple of drones and expand very safely and get so far ahead of your team while doing a little bit of damage. And usually, you're going to lose at least 1 player if you're going against a double Zerg team. So playing 3-on-2 is very difficult. The expansions are made perfectly for Zerg because in most cases they're kind of tucked off to the side, but they still have a pretty wide area in which Zergs can engage incoming armies and go for surrounds and whatnot. So there's not a whole lot of spaces that are really small and choked off. Probably the narrowest spot is maybe this part on the map right here, but still that's pretty wide. Hellions are also great on this map just because if a Zerg team ends up going for lots of early Lings and say there's a Terran player who makes a bunker somewhere along here, or even a Protoss player makes some cannons, you can still harass the mineral line and prevent them from mining by just coming off to one side of their base. And you're going to have Hellions out if they go for a forge opening before they get Stalkers, so there's no way to defend, really. If the game does drag on this map, which it rarely does, you're going to find that basically controlling these Xel'Naga towers is going to be crucial, and making sure you keep an eye on these destructible rocks. Because once you get kind of into the later portions of the game, really most of the fighting is going to take place from this point here down to this point here. So it's going to be a lot of offense and defense based on these areas right along in here near the Xel'Naga towers. Okay, the next game we'll go into is Green Acres, which is a pretty balanced map for all the races then.